We are back on the road to City Hall. Today in South Africa, President Obama took part in a big memorial for the late South African president and anti-apartheid leader Nelson Mandela. In his remarks, Obama made clear that Mandela had a lasting impact on our country and the rest of the world. Locally, the City Council's Progressive Caucus has been trying to flex its muscles in the race for Speaker of the City Council, but despite its efforts, the Speaker may ultimately still be picked by the Democratic county leaders, as it usually is. Here to talk about those topics and more, we've got the NY1 wise guys, former City Council Speaker Peter Verloon Sr., former Public Advocate Betsy Gotbaum, and former City Controller Bill Thompson. Senator Alphonse D'Amato will be back next week. Thanks for joining us. Good to see all of you.
Good seeing you.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about Nelson Mandela. Mr. Speaker, I see you brought in a
I
photo.
Did. Yeah, this was one of the most thrilling moments in my life and the city's life when Nelson Mandela came to City Hall, and it was my pleasure with Mayor Dinkins to greet him. But we have been very active in the City Council for him. Back in 1985, when I was Chairman of Government Operations, we were the first ones in the country to pass a divestment law, saying that unless you let this gentleman out of jail, and unless you start doing whatever you can to end apartheid, we're going to divest. And we spent billions of dollars, which hurt them quite a bit.
You know, I wanted to ask you about that, Mr. Controller. I mean, back then, there was a lot of shareholder activism around this particular issue. There was activism around carnation on a sort of an unrelated topic. It seems like it has kind of died out as a sort of a popular, very public strategy.
It still is alive. I mean, if you look, and I happen to have been a representative at that point, even with a small part of a vote, on the New York City Employees Retirement System Board. And New York City's pension funds, particularly NYSERS, were probably some of the first in the nation to divest in companies that were doing business with South Africa and helped to lead the way. It hasn't ended. If you look, New York City, both with South Africa, Northern Ireland, and the McBride Principles, but also if you look at Iran, had moved forward and started to divest in some companies doing business in Iran in the last 5 or 6 years. So it still, as a weapon, as a tool, divestment is still there. And we learned all of that, back in the movement to end apartheid in South Africa.
I guess maybe we've been sloppy or selective about it. You know, I mean, we know that there's slave labor in China, or at least in parts of China, or abysmally low wages, and yet, you've got tourism, you've got cultural exchanges, you've got half the stuff out of Walmart is coming from there.
Well, I think the problem is that there's no real effective movement in some of those countries. I think North Korea and China to kind of get this going. And I don't know how you do it here if there isn't one going there. I mean, there certainly was one going in South Africa, as I recall. So I don't know how you would start that movement. And it's an awful big place, China.
Economic pressure is probably one of the best ways you can do it. As a matter of fact, following up on what Bill just said, in 1986, when I was finally elected leader of the council, we were buying, our Department of Board of Education was buying their lunch food from South Africa.
Wow.
I said, did anybody here understand what we passed back here? And they were actually, this is absurd. And we stopped that. Now that meant a lot in terms of when the people start feeling that there's somebody really cares. And obviously the state followed suit, the federal government started suit. When New York City does something, everybody followed suit. And that was a great way of getting around. And it was one of the reasons he came. He was very, very thankful.
I remember meeting some of the ambassadors and others well after the fact, and they, I said, I was a student activist, we kind of raised some hell and made a real nuisance of ourselves back in the 1980s. And he said, "Thank you." I mean, they really said that it was as part of how
the college campuses, the movement all across the country. People took note of it. Those in government, at least in New York and other places, took note of it. So, when Mandela came here in 1990?
1990.
It was huge. I mean, remember the parade? I was deputy borough president in Brooklyn. I remember calling over to City Hall going, "I've got to come to the reception. You've got to get me in. You've got to get me there."
One of the biggest parades we ever had, and more so than what we did about divestment, about this man, his forgiveness, his love, showed much what you could do more than hate, which exists in too many places in the world.
Well, President Obama said today, and I imagine a number of public leaders say the same thing, is that he made us want to be better. Absolutely. He makes us want to be less petty and so forth and so on. But the day-to-day grind. I mean, I've watched you guys over the year. It's not nearly as high-minded as we'd all like. I guess.
We operate out of love, as you know.
But in the end, it is. It was the example that it set, not just in New York, but around the world. Absolutely. And that leading from strength, being strong enough to lead, being strong enough to change a country and to be able to inspire others around the world, but at the same point strong enough to forgive. And I think that's it, having the strength inside when others, looking at things from the outside, it might have looked like, everybody was like, okay, we're going to follow, Nelson Mandela. He was getting beaten up inside. Within his own country, that there were people who wanted to take action against those who had, enslaved them basically for years. And he said no, so he got beaten up on both sides.
I don't know if I'm reading this into it, but I see President Obama almost physically, visibly struggling to try to get to that level, that elevated level, to put pettiness aside. He's been talking about it since he burst on the national scene in 2004.
It takes some time.
The minute he's done, they're calling him Pinocchio Obama,
Exactly.
death
Exactly.
panels,
And
birthers.
at the same point, in trying to turn the other cheek, it is clear that the Republicans in the House
Yeah.
and in Washington aren't. All it appears to be is weakness, unfortunately. So it's a very different situation.
I guess it takes two to be high-minded. We've got more to talk about. We're going to do that in just a minute. First, though, we're going to take a short break. Then we'll be back with the wise guys. Also tonight, I'll be talking with Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr. about the City Council's approval of a plan to convert the Kingsbridge Armory into a center for ice skating. And we'll sit down with another candidate for Speaker of the City Council, Daniel Garodnick. That's all coming up. Stay with us.